Good afternoon. Thank you for the privilege of being here. We have quite a riveting question before us. Why build something that will not last? And earlier I asked the group we were briefing with, have you ever embraced your mortality? I mean, unless you have an appreciation of the brevity of life, then this question will just pass through your head. But if you have an appreciation of that brevity, then the question will hold much significance. Okay, so my name is Raymund. What do I do? I work for a company called Momenta, which is a leadership training and performance improvement firm, as read by Ike earlier. On top of that, I help manage family-owned businesses. I've spent a tremendous amount of time with family corporations. In the past, I was president of the CMG Retail Group. Mr. and Mrs. Chan are here. I used to be president of the Generics Pharmacy. Sir Ben Liuson is here. And I used to be president of United Neon. Sir Bertram Lim and Danny Lim are here. Currently, I am an advisor and an independent director to General Holdings Incorporated, which is in the telecoms business. And I am also an advisor to the chairman of Racal Holdings Corp, which is into construction supplies and electric vehicles. Okay, so during that period, what did I do? I immersed very deeply with the founders. Tremendous wisdom to be found residing within the founders. So I always made sure to spend time with them. You can see that I'm with Mr. Ben Chan, Mr. Ben Liuson, James Simpkins, who is the heir of the Getz Brothers empire. And I tried to ensure that I grasped the core fundamentals of the company. I tried to understand their vision and their direction for the company. Along with that, they extended tremendous levels of trust, even entrusting their children as related to the succession process. Okay, so that being said, I connect with and powerfully engage the second, third, and even the fourth generation. You will see here the board of the CMG Retail Group. This is the second generation of General Holdings Corp. And the second generation of Racal Holdings Corp. I also consult extensively with several emerging entrepreneurs. On top of my day job, I train and develop leaders. I train and develop leaders from different companies across different industries. I work alongside CEOs to help assess their leadership teams and prepare emerging leaders for future leadership responsibilities. Thereby accelerating the succession process. Okay, I also coach key leaders from various industries. So I coach the Vice President of Marketing of San Miguel International. I coach the Vice President of Operations Enablement of SM Supermalls. And I coached a leader of the largest home needs store in the country, SM Home. I coached the founder of a rising chain of dental care clinics, particularly the COO. And I coached the vice president of franchise operations of Sea Oil. together with that, I also coached the general manager of Goodyear Tires for Philippines and Vietnam. Lastly, I also coached the CEO of the Far East Broadcasting Company. I collaborate with global functional heads to help understand their leadership needs at the country level and help develop interventions for them. So I train executive committees of various firms, help strengthen leadership teams, and challenge middle managers to rise to their next level of performance. So you could say that 2019 started out as an excellent year for me. At least it started that way. But that year would be interrupted. It would be interrupted for me in the most unexpected way. My family and I would be confronted with the battle of our lives. In the blink of an eye, I went from this someone at the peak of his health, at the top of his career, all of a sudden I shed 80 pounds. Yeah. Over maybe 1 to 2 weeks. Right? Just like that. So I'm going to begin our time by asking you a very penetrating question. Yeah? How long do you think you will last? That's why we were speaking about the brevity of life earlier. How long do you think you will last? I mean, we look at the statistics and it says the average age of a Filipino is 71, right? Give or take. Now, this question never really occurred to me until the 15th of November, 2019. On that occasion, so I will share with you this recent journey of mine. And hopefully we can all draw lessons from it. In doing so, I will share with you 10 laws for building to last. Law number 1. Okay? Law number 1. Remember, no one, and I mean no one, ever escapes adversity. Okay? Somehow, life will eventually throw unpleasant surprises and challenges your way. So, expect to be challenged. Expect to be challenged. Can you tell the person beside you, expect to be challenged? On one occasion, I was invited by my very good friend, Glenn Yu, CEO of Sea Oil. Glenn invited me to attend a leadership conference in Singapore. It was a well-attended conference, so I felt it was a good time to go. Anyhow, Singapore is just 3.5 hours away. It's really nothing to it. Cross over, attend the conference, and come back. At least that was my plan. Unfortunately, upon landing in Singapore, I was found to be unconscious. I was found to be unconscious on board the plane. To the extent that the entire flight crew, including the pilots, had already off-boarded the plane, I still remained unconscious. They couldn't wake me up. So the ground staff decided to rush me to Changi General Hospital in Singapore. Now, whenever I'm away, my family's never had any issues because I keep them well informed of my whereabouts, right? I tell them I've just landed, I'm claiming my luggage, or I'm queuing up for a taxi on the way to the hotel. Just arrived at the hotel, checked into my room. This is my room number. You can call me now. What can I say? I'm a good husband. My wife is not here to hear that, so please echo if you get to meet her one of these days. Um, so, that's what I normally did. But on this particular occasion, 3 hours had lapsed since the internet indicated that my plane had landed. And my family had not heard anything from me at all. So, they were thrown into a mild sense of panic. They suspected something is off, something's wrong. So my daughter, who is here today, somewhere there, so my daughter was trying to reach me on my mobile phone for 3 hours. It just kept ringing. I wasn't picking up. And she was getting so desperate. Finally, she got through the phone. Except, it was not me who answered. It was an ER nurse at Changi General Hospital. Imagine her surprise. The nurse informed my daughter that I had been hospitalized, but she could not disclose the details. So my daughter, who was simultaneously on Facebook, noticed that my younger brother, who's based all the way in Canada, get this, happened to be in Singapore at that very moment. So my daughter immediately called him up and she said, "Uncle, something's happened to Dad. Please cross over to Changi General Hospital." So my brother crossed over, he tracked me down and he found me. Except that was when the doctors shared to him their findings. And the findings, so my brother was able to find me, and the findings pointed to a condition known as subdural hematoma. Now, if you're not familiar, that meant that, this area between the brain and the skull, there is a space. Well, during subdural hematoma, that space is filled with blood. It means there was bleeding in my brain. And because this was so, the doctors were hinting at the need for emergency brain surgery. So my brother relayed this to my wife and children back here in Manila. And of course, they were completely devastated to hear the news. But the moment they heard the words emergency brain surgery, they immediately packed their bags, headed straight for the airport to catch the earliest possible flight to Singapore. The Lord would show and reveal Himself early during this case. And by the grace of God, my family was able to secure the last 3 seats on that flight to Singapore. I mean, the Lord's timing is impeccable, right? So when they got to Singapore, they headed straight for the hospital. However, at this point, and understandably so, my wife and my eldest daughter were just in no condition to think straight. They were overwhelmed by the turn of events, so they just couldn't think straight. So it was actually my youngest son. I call him the upgraded version. So it was actually my youngest son who stepped up to lead the family at the moment of crisis. Which brings us to law number 2. Okay. At the moment of crisis, somebody needs to take the lead. Okay? Especially when others lose composure. So as soon as they arrived at the hospital, the doctors immediately pressed my family for a decision to proceed with brain surgery. And my wife and daughter, they were too exhausted and drained. Um, so it was my son who was facing off with the doctors. And he said, "What do you need?" And the doctor said, "You need to sign a waiver." And my son said, "Give me the document, I'll sign it. You proceed with the operation." Um, so because they had to drain the blood from my brain already. Um, what you need to understand is, had the invitation not been extended for me to fly to Singapore, chances are this would have turned out to be a very different story. You probably have a different speaker today. So, if I had not flown to Singapore, chances are I would have stayed in Manila, would have been stuck in traffic where? Yeah, along EDSA. Doctors say I would have just fallen asleep in the car. My driver would be clueless as to my condition, and I would have just expired into the next life. Parang natulog lang. No? And he would have no clue that I had passed away. But because I boarded that flight to Singapore, I got to the hospital just in time. I was diagnosed right on time, and I was operated by among the finest surgeons in the region. I have a cousin who's a doctor, and he flew to Singapore, and he told my wife, judging from how the medical team has attended to him, had he remained in Manila, this kind of medical care would not be available. So, thank God, I landed in Singapore. After the operation, my family was under the impression that I was out of the woods, because they felt that I looked a lot better than when they first saw me. So they decided to have dinner outside of the hospital, but also to be able to relax and unwind after a very long and stressful day. When a loved one undergoes an operation, it's very stressful, right? But when a loved one undergoes brain surgery, it's a totally different level of stress. So they wanted to unwind. So they took a break outside of the hospital. But this temporary relief would be short-lived, because very early the following morning, one of the neurosurgeons called up my son, and he asked in an alarmed voice, "How far are you from here?" From the hospital, he meant. "How soon can you get here?" And my son said, "Doctor, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, your father is not well. You better come to the hospital right away." So they rushed to the hospital, and as soon as they got there, the doctor had a one-on-one meeting with my son. And the doctor updated him on my latest condition. That's my actual brain scan. And you will notice, when you draw a brain, you draw lines, right? That's the way the brain is structured. You will notice from the brain scan, because my brain was so inflamed, the lines actually disappeared, if you notice. So the doctor spoke to my son, and the doctor told my son, who goes by the same name as me. He told my son, "Raymond, we've convened as a medical team, and we're recommending a second round of surgery." Now, this actually irked my son. And he said, "What do you mean, second round of surgery?" He said, "Doctor, this is not a simple ankle sprain. This is brain surgery. And you're telling me my father has just been through the perils of the first surgery yesterday, and here you are now telling me just one day later you want to open him up again. And the doctor insisted, very politely of course. He said, son, the intracranial pressure in your father's brain is just too much. We need to relieve it. So my son found himself in a very difficult position. So he decided to come over to me. Of course, I was comatose at that time. He comes over to the ICU. He comes by my side and he whispers in my ear. And he said, Pops, I gotta make some decisions. And the fact is, there is just no way for me to know up front that I'm making the right call. So he said, Pops, if and when I give the doctor the green light to proceed with the second round of surgery, I need you to promise me. I need you to promise me that you're gonna fight to make it through. And I mean really fight, Dad. And he said, you know, Pops, there's just too much of the future that's in front of you and me. Do not leave me now because I cannot afford to lose you. And so at that point, my son felt he needed extra input to make that critical call. So call it divine guidance, but he decides to call perhaps the most influential neurosurgeon in Singapore, Dr. Louis Tan. Dr. Louis Tan is a senior consultant of the National Neuroscience Institute of Singapore. My son did not know him. He just got his number, and he decided to give Dr. Tan a call. Now, what are the chances? An unknown number, a very busy doctor, what are the chances that he would pick up? But the doctor picked up the call. And so my son had 10, 15 awkward seconds to introduce himself to the doctor. He introduces himself, he summarizes my situation, and in desperation, he asks the doctor point blank. He said, Doctor, if you were in my place, would you proceed with this second round of surgery? Now, surprisingly, the doctor freely shared his thoughts with my son. And the doctor said, Son, how old are you? And my son said, I'm 26. So the doctor said, I can imagine this decision must weigh like a ton on your shoulders. I said, well, there are certain things you need to understand to come to an informed choice. And he said, first of all, there are no guarantees here. Your father may or may not make it through the procedure. Second of all, I need to ask you, are you aware of what this second surgery entails? My son said, no, doctor, why? He says, well, we need to perform a craniotomy. Okay? That means we're gonna have to remove 1/4 of your father's skull. My son said, what? And, doctor, is this absolutely necessary? And doctor said, yes, it's necessary. Intracranial pressure is too high. The brain needs to be relieved. And the doctor said, if you are asking me for my professional opinion, whether I would proceed with the second surgery or not, my answer is yes. This could be the life-saving surgery that your father needs. And so having received that input from Dr. Tan, my son took time to process the decision. Brings us to law number 3. Okay. During critical decisions, remember that perspective means everything. Okay? You've got to decide based on the right perspective, not on emotion. When my son was emotional, he felt that the surgery was a threat to my life. The input of the doctor shifted his thinking towards a life-saving surgery. So we have to remember to be guided by the right perspective. During this time, friends and family began to arrive in Singapore from Manila, which was a relief to the family because they had started to feel very isolated and very alone. I'm going to start to speak in an accelerated fashion because we have a timeline to meet. But no sooner had the guests settled down when one of the neurosurgeons called up my son again. And he asked for a one-on-one meeting with my son. And during that time, the doctor updated my son on my condition, and the findings was that there were no improvements despite the surgery. So the doctor said, well, the good news is nothing bad has happened. The bad news is nothing good has happened either. So the doctor looked at my son and he said, Raymund, we have convened once more as a medical team. And I know you don't like to hear what I'm going to tell you, but I will tell you anyway. And the doctor told my son, we're recommending a 3rd round of surgery. My son just shook his head in disbelief. But that seemed to be what was necessary in the course of what would hopefully be part of my healing. They needed to perform what's known as a craniectomy, but this time they needed to remove 1/2 of my entire skull. Midway through the surgery, the doctor delivered devastating news to my son. And they reported to my son that I had suffered several hemorrhagic strokes. And my son just fell to his feet, couldn't take it anymore. So that's me recovering from the 3rd round of surgery. You will notice that my head is already deformed from the removal of my skull. It turns out, though, that the deficit from the stroke was tremendous. The doctors reported to my son that my brain had actually been reset to that of a 1-year-old child. And my son said, Doctor, in English, what do you mean? And the doctor said, well, first of all, your father has lost the ability to speak. It's a condition they call aphasia, the loss of the ability to communicate owing to brain damage. So I could no longer speak, I could no longer stand and walk, and I could no longer eat or swallow on my own. Really like a 1-year-old child. So this was very tough news for my family to take. But also at that point, the Singapore doctors declared that they had done everything they could for me. It was now time to take me back to Manila. So the doctors devised a very detailed, very specific plan to transport me from Singapore to Manila in critical condition. So it took my children about a whole week to process the clearances because Singapore was really strict. Um, so they worked on my clearances. Ambulance comes over, brings me to the airport. Um, we get to the airport, and guess what? The airline decides to deny my boarding. So much for do not delay. Apparently, there was a Singapore Airlines doctor who felt it was just too much of a risk to accept a patient in my condition. So when that happened, this really angered my son. He went completely ballistic. And so it broke out into a very ugly shouting match between my son and the airline. To the extent that the doctors feared that my son would get arrested. Di ba, hindi ka pwedeng umusta ng ganyan sa Singapore. Brings us to law number 4. When met by opposition, we need to channel our energy towards the objective without getting distracted. We need to stay focused. Okay. So, my son was trying to crack his head, trying to figure out what he needed to do to break the deadlock between him and the airline. And then he remembered that I had a close friend who was based in Singapore, who was actually Singaporean. So, my son, and I had introduced this friend to my family just the year before, so they got to know each other. At that point, my son decided to get creative. And so, he hacked into my LinkedIn account. Okay? He hacks into my LinkedIn account. He secures the contact details of my friend. And he decides to send an email directly to Singapore's Deputy Minister, Hong Yuen Poon. Deputy Minister Poon was my classmate at MIT. And Deputy Minister Poon immediately responded to my son's email. And he asked, Raymond, how's your dad? And my son said, Deputy Minister, I apologize. We've been in Singapore for a while, but we've not had time to appraise you. The fact is, Dad is very ill. As we speak, they've just removed one half of his skull, and he's recuperating at the ICU of Changi General Hospital. And my friend, the Deputy Minister, was shocked. And he said, Raymond, please wait for me. I am coming. And almost immediately, the Deputy Minister arrives at the hospital. That's when he discovers that we're having this scuffle with the airline. So, he decides to walk directly into the headquarters of Singapore Airlines. Now, we weren't there. We do not know what he did. We do not know what he said. All we know is when he walked out of that office, we were allowed to board the plane back to Manila. Deputy Minister Poon is a fellow believer. Glory to God. So that's the Deputy Minister. He was completely shocked to see me in my condition. So we arrived back in the Philippines close to midnight because of all our flight delays. At that point, several of our doctor friends were waiting at Asian Hospital. Brings us to law number 5. When a team integrates together in one direction, strength is multiplied. My doctor friends combined their different specializations to give as accurate an assessment of my condition as they could. So they convened the meeting, discussed the findings, and it brings us to the next law. Law number 6. A team needs to brace itself and remain resilient from beginning until the end. Because sometimes when you think the worst is over, Well, the bell could ring for just one more round. And true enough, after the Asian hospital doctors convened, they asked for a one-on-one meeting with my son. My son is getting totally traumatized by the time his phone rings. But they asked for a meeting with my son, and true enough, the doctors recommended a 4th round of surgery. Yes, I know, I'm exhausted just by reviewing this. They needed to perform what's known as a cranioplasty, meaning they had to install a titanium plate to replace my skull. Remember, half of my skull is gone. So today, half of my head is actually a titanium plate. I don't make a sound when I pass through the airport. It's titanium, thank goodness. It's visible on X-ray, but it doesn't make a sound. Okay. Sorry. Brings us to law number 7. Okay? You've got to know when strength will be found on your knees as you yield to the Almighty in a posture of surrender. As soon as I could muster the strength, my family brought me to church. I needed to be in the house of God. I needed to be in the presence of God more than any other time in my life. So my family brought me to church. Now, this is the insane part of the story. I'm going to rush to a close in a while. This is the insane part of the story. So I had to go through rehab therapy. And I'll be the first to admit, therapy is downright painful. It is absolutely painful. It's no joke at all. For instance, my hands form a C because of the stroke. What the therapist would do is they would force bend back my fingers. Halos baliin na nila just to restore mobility. Those are just my fingers. Can you imagine what they did to the rest of my body? Right? It was exceedingly painful, is my point. So I started to quarrel with my wife. I said I wanted to quit therapy. When the doctors heard this, they said, Mr. Sanchez, we want to remind you of what's known as the 6-month golden rule. And I said, what's that? And they said, the 6-month golden rule states that if you've had a stroke, like I did, whatever is your condition 6 months later is how you will likely be for the rest of your life. And to my mind, not being able to speak, not being able to stand and walk, that's not my idea of a life. I mean, buti pa wala na lang. Right? But because of this golden rule, I had no other recourse but to endure the pain of therapy if I wanted to get well. Okay? How long? Well, nothing less than 450 extremely painful sessions. Right? It's absolutely crazy. But that's what I needed to endure if I wanted to get well. So it brings us to law number 8, my wife's favorite law. Okay? You need to know when to exercise tough love. Okay? Often, we've got to swallow the bitter pill. So, it turns out, fortunately, my wife did not listen to my plea to quit therapy. Because if she did, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you right now. And then we were blessed by such an outstanding healthcare team. So I was assigned 2 of the best male nurses from Asian Hospital who really took good care of me. But you know what I did discover? I discovered eventually, even though they hid it from me, before these 2 gentlemen arrived, I actually had a very beautiful nurse. For some reason, my wife changed her to 2 male nurses. I'm not sure why. And I had an outstanding physical therapist who not only enabled me to stand and walk, but he enabled me to shadow box. I started to hit the punching bag as strong as I could. And then I met Gerard, my occupational therapist. In Singapore, they introduced me to over 15 speech therapists. None of them could get me to speak a single word. Then I come home to Manila, I meet Gerard, and he asked me a very simple question. He said, "Sir, what do you like to do?" And I said, "I like to read." Of course, I spoke like a 1-year-old child. I like to read. You know? And he said, "What's your favorite book?" So I told him, "Finding Your True North." Who's the author of that book? Bill George. And so this Gerard, he researches the book and he researches the author. And then he makes it a talking piece between me and him every time he visits for therapy. And somehow that unlocked something in me. Yeah? Because remember, I could not speak for 1 whole year. But when I met Gerard, he enabled me to speak in just 1 week's time. Absolutely the Lord's work. Glory to God. So the Lord does send the right people at just the right time. Don't lose hope. Brings us to law number 9, second to the last, we're almost there. You've got to configure everyone to play to their strengths. So make sure team members are assigned in their areas of best fit. Now, we're coming to the last law. There was also an outpouring of God's provision. Remember, this was Singapore. Not exactly the cheapest place to be, right? Especially if you decide to have 3 brain surgeries. But I'm blessed. I'm blessed because in this lifetime, in my career, I've worked for 3 tycoons. 2 of them are here. Mr. Ben Liuson and Mr. Ben Chan. And I'll never be able to thank them enough. Because the 3 of them all flew to Singapore to extend moral support to me and my family. And then there was James Simpkins who flew in from London, also my former boss. Now all 3 of them, they bailed me out because we racked up this staggering bill in Singapore. And then there were friends who prayed very fervently. Sir Bertram Lim, and also gave very magnanimously. And then, you know what also touched our hearts? Employees of mine from the last 10 to 20 years. They sacrificially pooled their resources. And they sacrificially contributed as much as a whole month's salary in an attempt to rescue an old boss they haven't even seen in the last 10 to 20 years. I mean, they're not like Mr. Chan or Mr. Liuson or Mr. Simpkins. They're not billionaires. They're ordinary rank and file employees with real families and real needs. And yet, they contributed so much. I mean, would you do that? Would you sacrifice a whole month's salary for an old boss you haven't even seen in a long time? And yet they did. so much was happening, but my family had one goal. And that was to bring me home alive. That was their singular goal, their singular focus. It brings us to law number 10, the last law. We're finally here. Okay? Effective teamwork culminates in moments of breakthrough. Because, as of today, I am completely healed by the grace of God. So I'm back to doing what I love to do the most. Physically, I'm stronger than I've ever been. My mind is much sharper than before, and I'm even more productive than ever. My daughter doesn't like this part. But we're already here, so what can I do, right? So, this is my physical therapist. And I've always wondered why this kid was at home. My wife would be overly busy preparing food, juice, all kinds of stuff. And I thought, what is going on here? Why is this kid so special? And then I figured it out. My wife fancied him as a future son-in-law. Now, so my daughter and I never talked about this. But he's moved on to the US, where he's practicing his craft. But that's the backstory there. So I'll skip that because my daughter is cringing. Okay, so finally, there are several personal takeaways I'd like to leave you, but we don't have much time. I will leave you with one, okay? And it would be this. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2 says, the day of salvation is today. And what I'm trying to tell you is, if you have never ever made your peace with God through a relationship with Jesus Christ, do not let this day pass. Okay? You're not hearing this story by accident. Okay? Remember, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Surrender your life to Jesus Christ today. Do not let it pass. And so, if you find yourself in the clutches of adversity, unite as a family, stage the greatest comeback ever, and bring glory and honor to God. Thank you.